Last episode, we saw a tyrannical king fall. King John squeezed the English people dry. He lost massive ancestral lands in France. He fought bitterly with the powerful pope. The furious English barons finally rebelled. They formed the massive army of God. They trapped the king in London. Both sides met in the muddy meadow of Runnymede. John was forced to seal the Magna Carta. It stated no king was above the law. The treacherous king immediately broke his word. A brutal civil war tore the country apart. John died miserably from a terrible disease. His unexpected death accidentally saved the throne. The absolute power of the crown was permanently fractured. We are doing a comprehensive series on the grand history of Britain, covering everything from mud villages to fractured kingdoms. New episodes will drop every single week. So make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an update. 50 years after the Magna Carta, a new, terrifyingly ambitious monarch took the English throne. King Edward I was a towering, highly intimidating figure known as Edward Longshanks. He was a hardened, battle-tested warrior who had successfully fought in the Bloody Crusades. Edward was absolutely determined to completely restore the lost authority and absolute power of the medieval crown. He looked beyond the borders of England and decided to aggressively expand his royal dominance over the entire island. His first target was the fiercely independent, rugged mountainous territory of Wales to the west. The Welsh were a proud, rebellious Celtic people who had successfully resisted English rule for centuries. They were led by a powerful prince named Llewellyn ap Griffith who boldly refused to pay homage to the English king. Edward used this political insult as a perfect excuse to launch a massive, highly coordinated military invasion. In the year 1277, a huge English army marched across the border into the dense Welsh forests. Edward did not just rely on heavily armored knights. He revolutionized his army by heavily recruiting deadly archers. His forces completely cleared thick woodlands to prevent the Welsh rebels from using their traditional ambush tactics. The English army ruthlessly pushed the Welsh defenders deep into the freezing, unforgiving mountains of Snowdonia. Edward cleverly used his powerful navy to completely blockade the Welsh coast and cut off all their vital food supplies. Facing total starvation, Prince Llewellyn was ultimately forced to surrender and accept humiliating peace terms. However, the deep resentment of the Welsh people exploded into a massive armed rebellion just a few years later. Edward returned to Wales with an even larger, much more brutal military force to crush the uprising permanently. This time, the English king showed absolutely no mercy to the native Welsh fighters or their families. Prince Llewellyn was tragically killed in a minor skirmish, and his severed head was proudly displayed on a spike in London. To ensure the Welsh could never rise again, Edward embarked on the most expensive building project in English history. He constructed a terrifying, impenetrable ring of massive stone castles completely encircling the Welsh territories. He brought thousands of skilled stonemasons from across Europe to build these incredible fortresses. Hundreds of heavy supply ships were needed to transport the sheer volume of stone and timber to the coast. Fortresses like Carnarvon and Conwy were towering, engineered masterpieces of absolute military domination. They featured incredible concentric walls, heavily fortified gatehouses, and deadly overlapping fields of archer fire. These imposing stone giants were specifically designed to visually crush the spirit of the conquered Welsh population. The English crown nearly went bankrupt paying for these massive architectural projects of pure intimidation. Edward completely stripped Wales of its political independence and officially absorbed the territory into the English crown. He even presented his own infant son to the defeated nobles as the very first English Prince of Wales. With the western border fully secured in stone and blood, the ambitious king turned his greedy eyes toward the north. The ancient, proud kingdom of Scotland was about to experience the absolute, terrifying fury of Edward Longshanks. In 1286, the King of Scotland tragically died by falling off his horse in the dark. His only living heir was a young, sickly Norwegian princess named Margaret, the Maid of Norway. The young Norwegian princess was only 7 years old when she died of severe seasickness on her dangerous voyage. This unexpected tragedy plunged the Scottish kingdom into a massive, highly volatile succession crisis. 13 different powerful nobles fiercely claimed the empty Scottish throne, threatening a brutal, bloody civil war. The two strongest claimants to the throne were powerful lords named Robert Bruce and John Balliol. Desperate to avoid total national destruction, the Scottish lords asked King Edward of England to act as a peaceful mediator. This was a massive, fatal political miscalculation that would cost Scotland its precious independence. Edward agreed to judge the dispute, but only if the Scottish nobles legally recognized him as their supreme overlord. He demanded that every single royal castle in Scotland be temporarily handed over to English control. Under the heavy threat of an English invasion, the terrified Scottish lords reluctantly agreed to his harsh terms. Edward carefully chose a weak, easily manipulated noble named John Balliol to be the new king of Scotland. He intentionally humiliated King John at every turn, constantly demanding heavy taxes and Scottish troops for English wars. The Scottish nobles finally had enough of this English tyranny and boldly forged a secret military alliance with France. When Edward discovered this treasonous treaty, his absolute rage was utterly terrifying to behold. If you're enjoying this historical journey so far, please take a quick moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. He immediately marched a massive, heavily armed English army across the northern border to completely conquer Scotland. His forces laid a brutal, merciless siege to the wealthy Scottish trading port of Berwick. The English soldiers breached the wooden walls and violently slaughtered thousands of innocent civilians in the streets. When King John Balliol finally rebelled, he gathered a weak army that was completely unprepared for English tactics. Edward easily marched north and completely crushed the Scottish army at the disastrous Battle of Dunbar. He forced the cowardly King John to formally abdicate and violently stripped him of his royal garments. He installed English garrisons in vital strongholds like Edinburgh and Roxburgh to ensure absolute compliance. To completely break the Scottish spirit, Edward stole the sacred stone of destiny, the ancient coronation seat of Scottish kings. He hauled the heavy stone back to London and placed it under his own throne in Westminster Abbey. Edward installed cruel English administrators to heavily tax the conquered people and garrisoned his troops in Scottish castles. The English king confidently believed he had permanently crushed Scotland with his heavy iron hammer. But from the ashes of this crushing defeat, a legendary, fearless new rebel leader emerged from the shadows. William Wallace was not a wealthy nobleman, but a minor landowner with a burning, absolute hatred for the English occupation. William Wallace was a towering figure, famously reported to be over 6 feet tall and incredibly strong. He ignited a massive, violent uprising by dramatically assassinating a high-ranking English sheriff in the dead of night. He gathered outlaws, angry farmers, and minor knights who had lost everything to the English into a fierce rebel force. Unlike the cowardly Scottish nobles, Wallace completely refused to compromise or negotiate with the English invaders. In 1297, a massive, heavily armored English army marched north to crush this irritating peasant rebellion. The English commander was the highly arrogant Earl of Surrey, John de Warenne, who vastly underestimated the Scottish threat. The two opposing forces met at a narrow, wooden crossing over the River Forth known as Stirling Bridge. Warenne foolishly slept in late on the morning of the battle, causing a massive delay in the English deployment. Wallace cleverly positioned his unarmored spearmen on a high hill overlooking the narrow, bottlenecked bridge. The heavy wooden bridge was so narrow that only 2 armored horsemen could possibly cross it side by side. Wallace waited patiently as the heavy English knights slowly began to cross the wooden bridge. When exactly half of the English army had crossed the river, Wallace ordered a massive, devastating charge. The Scottish spearmen slammed into the trapped English knights before they could form their defensive lines. The heavily armored English soldiers were violently pushed into the deep, muddy river where hundreds quickly drowned. The slaughter was so complete that the river ran thick with the blood of the English aristocracy. It was a stunning, absolutely humiliating defeat for the supposedly invincible English military machine. William Wallace instantly became a national hero and was officially appointed as the sole guardian of Scotland. King Edward was completely enraged by this embarrassing loss and personally marched a massive new army into Scotland. He brought thousands of deadly Welsh longbowmen, introducing a terrifying new weapon to the northern battlefields. At the incredibly bloody Battle of Falkirk, Wallace arranged his spearmen in tightly packed defensive circles called schiltrons. The dense walls of wooden spears initially repelled the heavy, thunderous charges of the English knights. However, Edward cleverly pulled his cavalry back and ordered his deadly archers to rain iron-tipped arrows upon the Scots. The unarmored Scottish spearmen had absolutely no defense against the devastating, relentless hail of arrows. Gaps were violently torn into the defensive circles, allowing the English cavalry to charge back in and slaughter the rebels. Wallace barely escaped the horrific massacre with his life, fleeing into the dark forests as a hunted fugitive. Wallace was stripped of his title as Guardian of Scotland after the devastating loss at Falkirk. He traveled to France in secret, desperately trying to secure foreign military assistance for his country. He managed to evade capture for 7 long years, waging a desperate guerrilla war against the English occupation. He was eventually betrayed by a fellow Scottish noble and handed over to the vengeful English king in heavy iron chains. Wallace was dragged for miles across the sharp cobblestones of London before reaching the bloody execution block. The English judges refused to let him speak in his own defense during the completely rigged show trial for treason. He boldly declared that he could not be a traitor to Edward because he had never sworn loyalty to an English king. He was subjected to the most horrific, agonizing execution the medieval world could possibly invent. His head was placed on a spike above London Bridge, and his body parts were sent to the 4 corners of Scotland as a warning. Edward believed that the brutal death of Wallace would finally extinguish the flames of Scottish independence forever. Instead, it created an immortal martyr whose legendary sacrifice only fueled a much larger, unstoppable rebellion. King Edward died on his way to fight the Scots again, demanding that his bones be carried into future battles. He left behind a completely bankrupt kingdom and a deeply bitter, endless war that would rage for centuries. Next week on our channel, the brutal wars of men are interrupted by an apocalyptic force of nature. We will witness the terrifying arrival of the Black Death as it sweeps violently across the entire island. Get ready to see how a microscopic plague wiped out entire villages and flipped the medieval economy completely upside down. You will discover how the surviving peasants suddenly gained immense power over their wealthy feudal lords. If you enjoyed this animated journey through castles and rebellions, hit that like button right now to show your support. Make sure to subscribe to our channel, Stickman Chronicles, so you're first in line when the next episode drops. Thank you for watching, keep exploring the past, and we will see you right here next week for the ultimate showdown.